So first of all, the main point I want to get across to you in this webinar is that bluff failures along our section of shoreline, it's not a matter of if they will happen, it's really a matter of when they're going to happen. And I also just want to point out that this webinar is kind of specific to the bluffs that are like 15 meters plus in height. So if you live on a really tall bluff, this is going to apply to you. And so here's a photo of just a typical bluff that you see in our section of shoreline. And there are kind of a lot of things going on that are impacting erosion. So the first thing is the erosion from the bottom of the bluff. And so this is from wave activity that is eating away at the bottom of the bank. And this is something that you can see. So you're probably a little bit aware of this if you have a property along a bluff. And then another thing, if you live near a stream or a watercourse outlet, you'll also have erosion going on in that area as well. So there'll be some down cutting in the stream, and then it'll erode from the sides as well. So that's just another factor that if you live near a gully or a stream outlet, that is also causing some erosion issues on the property. And then we also have overland flow. So that's the water. If you have seen a really strong storm event or during the spring melt, you'll see water running off the land and into the lake. And in this photo in particular, you have little what we call rills at the top. So this is where the area is kind of concentrated and where the area is kind of eating away at the bank from the landward side of the bluff. And then lastly, we have this groundwater seepage area. So this is a little different because it's something that you can't really see happening, but the groundwater gets concentrated and it gets really wet and saturated in the spring, for example. So this is also causing erosion and an unstable bank just because as that groundwater gets more saturated, failures are more likely. And so I just want to kind of point out that all of these things are really playing a factor in erosion on a property. It's not just one thing causing it. So for example, if you were to stop alto erosion on your property, you'd still have that groundwater zone that's adding weight to the bluff and making it unstable. And vice versa, if you had no groundwater, for example, you'd still have those waves eating away at the bottom of the bluff. So if you theoretically wanted to stop erosion on your property, you'd have to stop all of these things, not just one piece. And so why is our section of shoreline so prone to erosion and failures? So the one thing is because it is a cohesive bluff. So that means that it sticks together quite well because it has really small particles like clay and silt, and that makes up the majority of the bluff. And then there's just small percentage of sand and gravel, which are larger, and that creates room in the bluffs and makes it more unstable. So really, in the summer, you can see when you have dry conditions, the bluff is really strong and it holds together really well. And if you knock on it, it's almost like a rock, it's so stable. But then when it gets saturated in the spring, for example, or the winter, or even fall, you can see it kind of ooze and flow. And that's because that sand and gravel combination that's in it. And so the photo on the left is that example of the hard bluff. And then the one on the right is the example of when it gets saturated and when it starts to flow. And this photo is just after the spring melt, actually. So you can see that, that bluff flowing on top of the ice. And so one reason why bluff failures are so imminent and why we're expecting them now is because of the water levels. So this is just a cycle from 1977 to current. And so that blue line is what's happened over the years, and that red line is the average water level over those years. So you can see here, there's a period of record high water levels, and that was last in 1986. And then water levels decreased right away, basically, and dropped right off. But even though the water levels were lower, we saw a lot of bluff failures in 1987. And so if we move forward to the record high water levels that we saw last year, so 8 out of 12 months, we saw record high water levels last year. And again, the pattern was kind of similar. It's dropping really fast, which is great because that means that the toe erosion is going to possibly slow down. But the thing is, again, once the toe has gone and once the bottom of the bluff has eroded, that's when we expect the top of the bluff to fail after that. And so really, once the toe or the bottom of the bluff is gone, the bluff is just waiting for those right soil moisture conditions to start failing. And so if you bought a property within this period of low water levels, you wouldn't have seen the cycles or all of the failures that happened in '87. So just be aware that it is a normal cycle of our lake, and it will continue to erode even just after water levels have declined. And so one thing we're really sure of is that whatever erosion happens at the bottom of the bluff will happen at the top of the bluff. So for example, if 15 meters erodes from the bottom of the bluff, so that red area, once it erodes, you'll project that 15 meters at the top of the bank, and that will eventually erode too. So that is one thing that we are certain about. And again, it's not an if it'll happen, but it's a when it will happen. So here are just some examples of where we have already lost the bottom of the bluff in our shoreline. So these are real examples, and they're just some comparisons from 2017 until 2021. So just within 4 years' time, we've seen a lot of toe erosion. And so you can see these yellow boxes are just landmarks that are the same in both photos. So just kind of pointing those out so you can better take a look and compare what has been lost. So the staircase, for example, and then this tree I pointed out. So in this area, about 12 meters, so 39 feet horizontally have eroded from the bottom of the bluff. And the exact same timeline and the exact same idea of choosing some landmarks in there. And in this area, 16 meters, so again, about 52 feet horizontally have been eroded from the bottom of the bluff. And I'm just going to go through a bunch of examples just because it is pretty relevant along our shoreline. So again, showing just the amount of erosion that's happened within those 4 years. In this area, again, about 12 meters, so 39 feet. And lastly, this is an area where we've seen a lot of erosion at the bottom of the bluff, probably one of the bigger sections of erosion and toe that we've lost. So again, just choosing some landmarks here to get a comparison. And so about 20 meters horizontally in this area, or 65 feet, have been lost from the bottom of the bluff. So in each of these circumstances, you can kind of project, so those 20 meters or 65 feet. Since it's been gone at the bottom, we're just waiting for the right soil moisture conditions for it to fail at the top of the bluff. And so what are these failures going to look like? There are a couple of different types that we see it across our section of shoreline. And the first one is called a rotational failure. So similar to the other diagram I showed, we have this plug at the bottom of the bluff, and it's kind of holding up the rest of the bluff and keeping it in place. And when we have high water, erosion occurs at the bottom of the bluff. And then even though the water goes down, now there's nothing holding up that section of the bluff, and it's very unstable. And then a rotational failure, what we see is a large chunk kind of slump in a curve. Like this, and these are pretty dramatic, and we have some photos of previous ones that have happened in our shoreline. So here is an example of a large rotational failure that happened in November of '87, so again just after the high water levels in '86, and that soil moisture condition was just right to make this happen. And so we have this large scale failure. And here's a person just to give you a sense of scale of how big these actually are. And you can see that there's structures in the background, and there's some debris in the front of this photo. And it was actually a structure that didn't get completely destroyed, but it did get repaired and then moved back away from the top of the bluff. And here's just the same event, but looking the other way. And again, we have that structure that was repaired and moved back. And then we have this shed structure that was actually just on the right side of the failure, and it happened to be okay. But just to give you a sense of how big these can be, so just in conversation with people that were around when this failure happened, it was about 500 meters long, or 547 yards in length. And the drop was about 3 meters or 10 feet. So again, these are pretty dramatic, and they can be pretty large in scale, and the drop off again is pretty steep. And so that is what a rotational failure looks like. And then this is another example, and it's more of a landslide type failure. So you can actually see the salt mine in the background there at Goderich. And so this bank, instead of having a huge chunk slide at once, this one was more of a flowing event. So the bluff got really wet and it started to flow. And just pointing out that in this photo, there are lots of trees on the bluff that failed. So just noting that just because you have a really well vegetated bluff doesn't mean that it will stop erosion from happening. This is just a good example because it's so vegetated. But if you were to cut the trees on the bluff, it would definitely speed up the process, which you don't want to do. So keeping the vegetation in place is good, and it does help a little bit, but it will not prevent erosion or a failure from happening. And just some more examples. So again, this is more of like a landslide failure. So just chunks of the bluff sliding into the lake. And this was, May 2019. And just noting at this photo that you might not want to be walking along the beach during this type of failure. So just also keeping that in mind. And here's another failure that happened just this year in July. And again, this is more of a sliding event, but just noting that when the ground is saturated, there is a higher chance for failures to happen, but it doesn't mean that it will only happen in the spring or during a large, like many large rage events in the fall, for example, and that they can really happen at any time. So we think of July and the summer generally as being pretty dry when you compare it to all the other seasons, but there was still a failure this year in July. So just keeping that in mind, that they can really happen at any time. And so this is just a before and after of the failure that I showed in the previous slide. So this was on the left, May of 2021, and then on the right, that was after the failure had happened. So again, the bluff was pretty well vegetated, but the slope was just so steep that it was pretty unstable. And maybe after a couple of rain events, that's when it decided that it was the right soil moisture conditions to start sliding. And so just pointing it out in both photos, on the left, that's kind of the chunk that is about to fall, and again, looks really well vegetated. But then you can see that that whole piece kind of went into the lake and slid. So it is just the same chunk, and now it has fallen into the lake. And maybe a misconception is that people think once these failures happen that it will kind of recreate that plug at the bluff and hold it up in place. But since the soil is so disturbed, now it's more vulnerable to getting eroded and moved offshore and downdrift. And in this photo, you can actually see the water is pretty blue on the side before the failure. And then on the downdrift side, you can see that the water is really murky, and that's because the water is just eroding away that sediment. And we would expect for this cycle to continue throughout wet conditions. And here is an example from an aerial view of the erosion and what's been going on. So we actually had ortho imagery taken last summer just to capture the erosion that's happened at the bottom of the bluff. So in this photo, we have the red line, which was the previous toe of bank, and then the brown line is the toe of bank in July of 2020 when we took the aerial imagery. And then the green line is the top of bank, and the dashed yellow line is the approximate impending failure zone. So the area that we expect will eventually, or we know will fail eventually. So in this case, about 20 meters has been lost from the bottom of the bluff. And when you project that onto the top of bank, so we would expect all of this area to fail eventually. And so here's another example of the same idea. We have the amount that's been lost at the bottom of the bluff. And then when we project that on the top of the bluff, about 10 meters, you can see that there's actually a structure that would be involved in these failures. So always keeping note and being aware of if your property or your structures are really close to the edge of bank, just being really cautious and being aware of that. And so here is a photo of a bluff, and I'm just going to kind of show you how these failures are consecutive. So the red dashed lines are previous failures. So you'll see there's kind of like a slope and then a plateau and then a slope and a plateau. And so each one of these was a previous failure. So this was a rotational failure at once. This was a rotational failure. And so you can see how they're consecutive and they go landward each time. So you can see the green line is what the current top of bank is. So we would expect the next failure to be landward of that green line. It would include that structure there in the photo. So these are all the things that we know, but there are things that we are unsure of. So 3 things mainly are the timing, the type of failure, and the size of failures. So timing, again, like I've been saying, during wet conditions, they're more likely, but they can happen at any time, just like we saw this year in July, a failure when it's pretty dry. So they can happen basically at any time, and so that's an unknown for us. Another thing is the type of failure. So it could be a rotational failure that happens, it could be landslide failures, it could be a mixture of both. So it's just, again, we're unsure of what types of failures might happen in each section of shoreline. And then lastly, we are unaware of the size of the failure. So it could be one chunk all going at once, like in a large rotational failure, or it could be many small failures, maybe 1 meter 1 year, 5 meters the next year, 2 meters the next year. So that's another thing that we're unsure of. So I guess now I can go through some questions if there are any in the chat. Jean? Doesn't look like it, but
yeah, so I don't have any yet.
Okay.
So it may be that people are holding their questions to the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, so again, if you can just put your question into the chat, that would be great. And then we'll get to those questions at the end.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just keep going ahead then. So now we know what the failures might look like, and we know that they're going to happen pretty soon. But now I'm going to go over what should you do as a landowner if you live in one of these areas along the bluff. So the first thing is to be cautious and know the risks. So for example, joining this webinar is a great start. Just being more aware and educated of the risks of living on a bluff. So on the photo on the left, for example, you wouldn't want to be in a structure or walking along the top of bank because of that risk. And then also if, again, for example, if you're at the bottom of the bluff or walking down to the beach by your stairs on your property, you wouldn't want to be trapped at the bottom of the bluff during this. So yeah, just being aware of the risks being on top of the bluff, the bottom of the bluff, and walking down to the water. And so one thing to do is to simply just avoid the edge of the bluff if you can. So in this photo, you can see there's a structure that's really close to the edge of the bluff. So just thinking, would I want to go up to the cottage this weekend? Maybe just double thinking that before you go ahead and do it. And we also strongly recommend moving structures away from the edge of the bluff, just to prevent any issues at all from happening. And then also I see very commonly along the shoreline chairs or picnic tables, things like that. If you wanted to have a fire or have your morning coffee looking at the view, people do that very close to the edge of the bluff, and maybe just thinking again, can I avoid this? Can I move my chairs back? Just because we don't want to be in a situation where there's a failure and you're just at the very edge of the bluff. Another thing you can do as a landowner is collect site-specific information about your property. So for example, contacting Maitland Conservation, for example, we can provide you with photos like the one below, for example, and just show the comparison of change throughout your property. And we can also send you maps of your property. So again, that aerial view looking down and showing you how much erosion has happened at the bottom of the bluff and projecting that on top and kind of seeing where you might want to avoid and stuff like that. But ours is more general information. If you wanted more in-depth and detailed information about the stability of your property or structure, we recommend contacting a geotechnical engineer. So they actually drill boreholes into the ground and get an idea of soil composition, soil moisture, and they can kind of give you a better idea of what failures they think might happen. So maybe they can give you a better idea of, would it be a large rotational failure, or is it more just landslide failures, and give you a better idea of those types of things and maybe the timing and then the actual stability of the property. And so things to be aware of. So again, wet conditions. If you have really, really strong rain events for a long period of time, or if you have rain on snow events in the winter, or really, really wet spring, and when the spring melt happens, there tends to be a lot of saturation in the bluff. So just thinking about that when you go to the cottage. And then also tension cracks. So looking for these cracks, they actually run parallel to the top of the bank. So not on the slope of the bluff, but on top of the bluff. And so in this photo, you can see that the area closest to us is just a very small crack in the ground, but you can see how it escalates and gets pretty big. So just being aware that if you do see a crack, to really take advantage of it, because it doesn't always happen, and it is a warning sign that there will be a failure. And everything from that crack all the way to the edge of the bluff is going to go eventually very soon. So really keep an eye on the ground when you're going up to the cottage, or if you live there permanently, definitely look around the ground often and avoid those areas, and let neighbors know if you see something. Really spread the word so that people are aware that things are starting to move. And if there is a structure involved, definitely call us. So if there is a structure that's either on the tension crack or really close to the edge of it, it's definitely good to let us know as well, and we can come out to the site. And so here is an example of just another tension crack that has happened recently with the failure this July. So here is the little yellow person at the top of the bluff, and they were taking the photo on the right looking down. So the photo on the right, you can see that there's the tension crack right at the edge of the bluff, and it looks relatively small, but you can see that that whole area from the crack all the way to the edge of the bank had slid into the lake. So again, this is just, if you do have that warning sign, you don't always have it, but if you do, really take advantage of it, let people know that it's happening, and really be aware and cautious of it. And so again, if you see that tension crack, really make use that you know it. So ensure that the water supply is cut off to any structures that could be involved. So for example, this structure is on the wrong side of the tension crack. So if you can turn off the water supply as soon as you can, if it's safe to do so, we really recommend doing that, just because once those pipes break and the water starts flowing into the ground, it'll really speed up the process of the failure. So if you cut it off, you might save the chance of the failure happening way quicker. And so what to do if a failure happens when there is a structure either involved or really close. So if there's a structure that is involved in a failure, we're going to go through the steps of what to do. But if a structure or a failure happens without a structure nearby, you can definitely let us know that things are moving, kind of give us an idea of the size of failure that happened, just so that we can kind of get ready and be prepared for how things are moving along the shoreline. So definitely good to be aware and let us know, let neighbors know. But if there's a structure involved, these are the steps that you should take. So the first one is to get as far away from the edge of the bluff as you can. I know people like to go take photos of it and everything, but it's a very unstable area, so you should definitely avoid it at all costs. And then the second one is to call 911 if there are people who are injured or trapped in the failure. So again, those large rotational failures, if the drop is really large and people can't get out, if they're trapped in a structure, definitely call 911 as soon as you can so that they can get assistance as soon as possible. And then again, from a safety perspective, if there are power lines that are impacted or you think they could be impacted, I would call hydro just to make sure that they turn off the power if possible. And then the next step would be to call MVCA's flood and erosion emergency number, which is listed below. So we can go out to the site and inspect it. And we have a list of geotechnical engineers who are familiar with the area and ready to go assess the site and make sure, set a perimeter and make sure that people are in a safe area, and that let people know if buildings should be occupied or not. And then lastly, calling the building department at the township or municipality just so that they can come and assess it also, figure out if things should be destroyed or repaired and moved, and they can figure that out. So yeah, just if you're kind of going through this, so for example, if a failure happens and there's a structure, first get away from the bluff. If someone is trapped, call 911, but if there's no power lines impacted or anything, then you wouldn't call hydro, for example. Yeah, so definitely write down the emergency number if you live in an area where you think that structures might be involved, just so that you're ready if it does happen. And so again, thanks for listening. Again, like Jane said, I'm definitely available to take questions here. Or if you have more questions about your property specifically, I can send you more information and kind of let you know how at risk your property is. And yeah, if you're listening to this recorded version as well, definitely feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.